Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. So on 19th and 20th of October, there was a major AWS outage. In today's video, let's try to understand what is it, why did it occur, and as someone who is working on AWS, what you should do in case of such outages. Every software engineer should understand the root cause of this outage and after effects of such outages. So make sure you watch this video till the end. Before we get to the crux of this issue, let's try to understand a very simple concept. What is a region and what is an availability zone? This is actually related to the video, so try to understand this carefully. When you look at cloud providers like AWS, they have their customers across the globe. So to be well connected to the customers, to eliminate latency aspects, to ensure high availability, what AWS does or cloud providers do, they set up their server rooms or they set up their data centers across the globe. So they identify the regions. For example, AWS has identified a region called Virginia in United States. And in Virginia, they have set up multiple data centers. In the world of cloud, we call them as availability zones. Similarly, US has identified another region in US, which is Ohio, and they also have bunch of data centers across Asia Pacific, Europe. So what I'm trying to say here is AWS identified regions, and within the regions, they have identified availability zones. Now, a very important region for AWS is US East one, which is Virginia, right? So Virginia is US East one, and within Virginia, they have 1A, 1B, 1C, so on. Now, the recent outage was related to US East one, and one reason why this became very, very popular is because 35 to 40% of entire AWS traffic goes to US East one. So if you consider 1 billion requests per day to the AWS services, understand how much is 35 to 40%. So this is why it is considered as one of the major outages of the century. Now, again, this is very, very unusual because usually we see outages when it comes to availability zones. That is one of the reasons why cloud providers usually set up multiple availability zones within a region, because they don't want outages in a complete region, or they don't want customers in one region to be completely impacted. So what they usually do is that they set up multiple availability zones. So even in case of some natural calamity in one area of Virginia, one of the availability zone might go down. Still, they have two availability zones, which are good to serve customers within Virginia. And even with two data centers, they can set up a proper high availability for their services. But this outage impacted entire Virginia region. That means this outage impacted 35 to 40% of entire AWS users. You can understand it that way. Now, why did entire region get into an outage? Let's try to understand the root cause. Now, just like us, right? When we work in companies, we set up observability platforms or we set up our own monitoring tools to make sure the services within the organization are healthy. Let's say you're working in e-commerce company, you might build an observability platform or you might use something from open source to ensure all the services of your e-commerce application are up and running. It can be your payment service, it can be your login service. So you typically rely on this monitoring platform to understand which services are healthy and which services are not. Similarly, Cloud providers are no exception. They also have their internal monitoring tools. And these internal monitoring tools are responsible for ensuring or understanding health of internal AWS services as well as instances. Now, the issue was with this internal monitoring tool. Now, within AWS, they can have multiple internal monitoring tools within a region, or they might have a single monitoring tool within a region, which is not very clear. But within US East 1, right, the monitoring tool, which is part of US East 1, was the culprit because it was reporting wrong health analysis. So actually the services of AWS were up and running. It can be EC2, it can be DynamoDB. Most of the services in US East 1 were running in a good state, but the internal monitoring tool was reporting wrong health status. And because it was reporting wrong health status and it is responsible for updating the DNS, so it updated DNS wrong. So basically DNS was assuming that the instances like EC2, DynamoDB, S3, they were down. So it was not forwarding the request to those instances. And one service that was critically impacted was DynamoDB. Now the reason why I said AWS might have had multiple internal tools, internal monitoring tools in US East 1, because in the explanation that they provided, in a very minimal explanation that they provided, they said the internal monitoring tool impacted DynamoDB through DNS. Because this internal monitoring tool was updating the DNS records, and because it was updating wrong, so they said DynamoDB was impacted. So requests were not getting to the DynamoDB instances. Now, it can be that they have multiple internal monitoring tools, and the monitoring tool that was responsible for DynamoDB health may be down, and the monitoring tool related to the other services might be up. Or it can be that because of the architecture of DynamoDB. Now, if you try to compare DynamoDB with, let's say, S3, right? So S3, when you create a bucket, it comes with 99.11 nines of durability. That means if you create a single S3 bucket, AWS makes sure your S3 bucket is replicated across different regions of AWS. So even if one of the region goes down, you still can access your S3 bucket, which is replicated to other regions. But DynamoDB is not like that. It's a NoSQL database, and it comes with a single door or front door setup. So if the region is impacted in which the DynamoDB instances reside, that means the DynamoDB instances are completely affected, unlike services like S3. Now, this can be two possible reasons. We are not exactly sure which one is right. Either AWS might have multiple internal monitoring tools in US East 1, the monitoring tool that is responsible for updating the DNS records of DynamoDB was impacted. This is one possibility. Or it can be because of the architecture of DynamoDB that DynamoDB is severely impacted. But Abhishek, what happens if DynamoDB is impacted? Why a single DynamoDB impact has impacted the entire region? Now, DynamoDB is a very important service for AWS. Let me explain why. So you might be using DynamoDB in your organization or not. But if you're using IAM, for example, so information related to your IAM, it can be your IAM session tokens, or it can be metadata information of your IAM. When you create IAM users, roles, even IAM profiles, AWS stores that information within DynamoDB. You might not have created that instance, but AWS internally stores the information of different IAM users across the globe within DynamoDB. Not only that, DynamoDB is also used by Lambda. Again, when you create a Lambda function, all your Lambda function related configuration, your Lambda function related metadata is also stored by AWS within DynamoDB. Even when you're using step functions, Amazon or AWS stores the stack state within DynamoDB. Similarly, if you're working with, let's say, workflows, so the workflow state is also stored in DynamoDB. Sorry, this is CFT, right? Let's say you're working with ECR or you're working with API gateway. In all of these cases, right? If you try to understand dependency of AWS on DynamoDB, it is huge. Now, because of this reason, although DynamoDB is severely impacted, it impacted all the major services of AWS. That's why you might have noticed this outage was gradual, right? Some people experience the outage instantly, and some people experience the outage late. Now I'll talk about why this outage took a lot of time for few people. I'll come to that point. But for now, I want to stress on the importance of DynamoDB internally within AWS. Now, another reason that multiplied the impact of this outage is retries. What does that mean? So, I just explained most of the services of AWS were not reachable, but these days people use a lot of SDKs. These days people use a lot of APIs to interact with AWS services. And these SDKs or programs that usually developers write, they involve retries. So a very simple example, let's say a developer writes a Python application that talks to S3 bucket, for example. So developers usually write retries within the code just to avoid any kind of unexpected interruption. So if the request fail once, they try to send requests at least 5 times, only then throw out an error saying connection to S3 bucket failed. Now this retries, because there is already outage and people were trying again and again, maybe manually or through SDKs. So this led to retry storm. So DNS service was already impacted, and because of this multiple retries, DNS cache was also impacted, right? So this retry storm led to caching related issues, and also this led to time to recovery increase. So you might have noticed AWS says outage was fixed in 2 hours or maybe in 2 to 3 hours, but for people it took almost 24 hours. There were people reporting on Reddit, people reporting on LinkedIn that my AWS services are still not up. This is because of retry storm. To be honest, AWS fixed the issue at their end, but the services came up gradually because of a lot of DNS cache and a lot of requests that created the cache. Now, what does it mean? Okay, so there was this outage. What you should do as a DevOps engineer or developer taking care of AWS? Should you create your resources in multiple regions? Now, I would say you should think about it, because you should not directly create resources in multiple regions. Understand what would it cost if you set up a multi-region architecture. These entire region outages are very, very rare. Last time I remember was in 2021, if I remember it right. So you might see such outages once in 4 years, once in 5 years. So if you go for multi-region architecture, although you don't need it, let's say, just because of this outage, if this multi-region architecture would cost you $2 million per year, for example, and outage costed you or it impacted $1 million for you, probably you should not do it. So make sure you consider cost, make sure you consider customer satisfaction. Because of this region level outages, customer satisfaction usually does not go down because your customers know it's a complete AWS outage. It is not issue from your end. So your customer satisfaction index might not come down. So just because of this global outage, if you're thinking of uh, multi-region architecture, I would say you should not be doing it, but at least set up high availability architecture using multiple availability zones, because the probability of a single availability zone going down is much more, right? So overall, you don't have to set up a multi-region architecture just to handle such outages. If it is really required, considering your customer base, go for it, but not for this outage. Now, a very interesting point, whether it is AWS or whether it is a SaaS platform, a PaaS platform, they usually come with service level agreements. Similarly, AWS also has a service level agreement for DynamoDB. It's very interesting to go through. I'll put the link in the description. I've taken this from AWS documentation. You know, I don't know what many of you thought about this outage, but the moment I saw the outage and the moment I saw that, AWS reports that the outage was for 2 hours, I instantly looked at the service level agreement of DynamoDB just to see what exactly is AWS going to do after this outage. So AWS says the service level agreement for DynamoDB, it is 99.99% or greater than 99%. So if you consider, somewhere between 99.99 and 99, roughly I just calculated it comes to 43 minutes or just around 60 minutes. But this outage was for 2 hours. Now, this is subjected to my understanding because SLA is very, very critical. I want you to go through it again and understand what does 99.99% to 99% come to. And if at all AWS agrees to it, if AWS agrees that, okay, their 2 hours breach is impacting the service level agreement, which is yes, according to me, then they have to, credit the service charges percentage of 10%. That means if your DynamoDB billing is 50,000 US dollars, 50K US dollars, then AWS would have to pay you a service credit of 5,000 US dollars. Now, what does service credit mean? Service credit is basically, AWS does not pay you in terms of cash, but AWS tries to fit this in the next billing cycle or maybe in the current billing cycle. If you have DynamoDB billing of 50,000, then they might ask you to pay 45K US dollars. Of course, a lot of this depends on your relation with AWS. This does not apply to free tier, right? Understand this. If you have a free tier and if you created these services, this outage might not get you a service credit. But if you're using AWS in your organization, yes, I think you should talk to AWS support. Not a lot of people are thinking about it, but if you have huge DynamoDB billing, why not? Just have a word with AWS support, get in touch with them. If you have good luck, you might get this 10% service credit. I'm also very interested to watch what AWS thinks about it. We might see press statements from them, or we might see some articles from them after this. So I'm also waiting to understand how this turns out. Overall, such outages are very, very rare, and the root cause is basically one of the AWS internal monitoring tools within US East 1 region. It was reporting false alarms. So it was updating DNS in a wrong way. Maybe services that are trying to talk to DynamoDB. Again, it can be EC2, it can be Lambda. They were not able to connect to DynamoDB because the DNS was not aware that DynamoDB is up and running or the instances are up and running. So this led to downtime of DynamoDB, which indirectly impacted most of the AWS services. What you should take away from this um, outage, probably you should not be thinking of a multi-region setup only for this outage, because these outages are very, very rare. But at least have a high availability setup, that is availability zones within a region. Try to create your infrastructure in that way. However, if you have global audience, if you have audience across the globe, across multiple regions, then probably you should go for a multi-region architecture. So this is all I have for today's video. If you have any questions, or if you want to add anything to this video, please let me know in the comment section. See you all in the next video. Take care.